Perhaps you're married to or very deeply care about a person who is very arrogant. As a matter of fact, it seems as if he or she always wants his or her way in everything. They have very little empathy for you. They seem not to understand what you feel. They don't particularly care about what you want. And they have these grandiose ideas about themselves, like, do you know how wonderful I am? Do you know I'm one of the most amazing people on the planet? And so they come across as somewhat egotistical, arrogant, as I may say, somewhat uncaring, at least on occasions. And when you got to thinking about that, you thought, maybe this just isn't right. And so what you did was you went online or you talked to somebody who apparently knows a little bit about something, or at least seems to. And as you talk to them, you come to the realization, oh my goodness, I think I may be married to a narcissist. And then, if that's really true, what in the world do I do? Well, before we talk about how you can understand whether or not you really are married to a narcissist, there's a couple of things we'd ask you to consider. With me today here is Jim Pourteau. Jim is the Director of Operations at Marriage Helper. Very intelligent guy, does a lot of work with us, also does a lot of consulting with people, not only in the business world, but with individual situations. So what do you think about this?
Well, I'm not going to lie, I'm starting to feel a little depressed because based on what you described, I'm starting to feel like I'm a narcissist. I started thinking, am I the example today, or are we going to put that under me?
Speaking of narcissists.
I'm the resident narcissist.
Yeah. Well, that's just it. If you look at those descriptors, now I have a book here, it's called the DSM-5, and you guys probably can't see that very well, but that's the Bible, if you will, of people who are in the psychological world when it comes to understanding people and making diagnoses. Now, we're going to refer to some of this in a minute. I'm not going to read you everything in the DSM-5, and if you want to go buy your own copy, feel free. I think you can get it on Amazon for like $150 or something like that. You might get a deal at $125, and if you want one, great. But let me tell you why it's a bad idea. You see, many people, and perhaps you've run into this as well, Jim, when I talk to people who have been through med school, and I talk about, well, what was it like the first year of med school? Almost always the first thing I hear is, you know, as we went through the medical books, reading about this disease, that disease, et cetera, I thought I had every one of them.
Oh, without a doubt. Well, I remember going through counseling training and thinking to myself, I have these problems in every piece of my own life and my family's life, and this is this. And of course, it was very limited knowledge. Based on almost no experience.
Exactly. And so if you get a book like this and you start reading through that, then you can convince yourself that you or somebody else has a certain disorder or whatever it might be, disease if it's a medical book. And so rather than actually it informing you and educating you, it just misleads you because you don't have the background to understand what it is.
Oh, and then if you couple emotion with that, you know, it's your doctor could walk in or your counselor can walk in if they're using their training, look at you, but they're not emotionally connected to your situation. It doesn't mean they don't have compassion. It just means they don't have the same area of emotion. But man, when we're emotional into something and then we read something, it's not being processed in our mind, which challenges. It's being processed in the mind of fantasy. And just like your dreams, anything can be possible when that comes in.
So before we talk about whether or not you may be married to a narcissist, let's just talk about one other thing, Jim. If I mislabel or put any kind of a label on my husband or my wife, how does that affect the way I interact and treat them?
Yeah, it's a pretty significant problem. In the last year, just myself, when we have 8 coaches now at Marriage Helper, but just in myself as a coach, I've seen somewhere around 1,000 coaching sessions. Wow! And so you get a good.
That was just Tuesday.
Yeah, that was just Tuesday. Do I look tired? And so in that you get a pretty good spectrum of what people are going with. One of the most common challenges I see people come in line with is that ability of, I think this. They are a sex addict. They are addicted to this, to men, to women, to attention. Right. They begin to diagnose they're a narcissist, or they are depressed, and it's a very common thing that happens with folks when they're trying to look for reason. I don't think as human beings we're comfortable with being without knowledge, that blank. So as we think of something, especially when it comes to a relationship that's important as a marriage, and we begin to obsess over it, we run out of that information. I know this, but I don't know that. And so I have to fill it in with something.
You know, I took a class one time when I was studying psychology, and the class was all about how people have come to think that they diagnose people ever since the day of Freud. Before Freud came along saying, oh, this is why people do this is why people do that. They've shown how that now it's permeated the world where we're all trying to figure out, why did he do that? Why did she do that?
It's powerful, and there's some things have a little thread of truth in them. Yeah. And I do understand knowing the why can sometimes give you the ability to make change, right? So I started, let's see, it's the new year, and then it was Monday, and so every Monday I start a new diet. And so I start this diet and I'm going to do it. I'm going to follow it and things like that. Well, the struggle that I have with that is there's a little truth to all these little diet plans.
Right.
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 It doesn't mean they're healthy. It doesn't mean they're sustainable.
But they have something within it that we look at and go, that makes sense to me.
Well, the ultimate desire is to be healthy or thin or whatever, right?
Right.
So we look at the long forecast goal and we think, well, then why am I fat? Well, you're fat because of this, or you're overweight because of that. And so if the why thinks it'll tell us something, instead of getting the real information we need. And so what I find is that with clients or people we're dealing with is if I knew the why, if I knew why she or he cheated, or if I knew why or he or she, it's their mom, it's this, it's whatever, then maybe it'll make me feel better. Well, the truth is it really doesn't. You might know why, but you don't always feel better as a result of it. And then once we get it in our head, remember that blank, I know this, I don't know this. Once we get that in our head, Joe, it begins to change everything else in that perspective. You cannot separate how you think or feel about a person and the filter in which everything they do gets processed. May I give an example real quick?
Please.
So one of those examples would be, I was talking to someone the other day and we were talking about the term racist. And it says once someone says another person is racist, whether it has a credible facts behind it or not, it puts a certain slant or skew in your mind.
Correct.
That means when you're out at some restaurant with them and they come up and someone says, John Doe over there's a racist. And you go, oh, really? Oh, my God, that's terrible, And then his dessert comes along and the person says, hey, we have yellow cake and chocolate cake. And John says, he's a Caucasian, he's white. And he says, I have the vanilla cake. In your mind, you go, oh, he is a racist. He didn't choose the dark cake.
Because now you're filling in the blanks where you don't know.
Exactly.
With what you think.
Exactly. And it skews and jacks up everything. Oh, and at that point, almost anything you see can validate what you think.
Yes. There's an interesting study, and we won't take a long time because we need to get to the gist of this about how to tell if your spouse really is a narcissist. But there was a study done many years ago, famous in the psychological world, where they took a set of students and they told these teachers that these students were all slow. Then they told these teachers that these students were very bright. And the teachers that thought they were very bright actually did things differently with them than the ones that thought they were slow. And they made bad grades with the teachers who thought they were slow and great grades with the teachers because the teacher now treats the other person based on that label.
We set them up for failure.
And we see that in marriages, don't we?
Absolutely.
People treat based on the label.
Absolutely. And then they try to you talk about the treatment. If the diagnosis is wrong, the treatment's wrong. What does that say about the healing or the outcome of it?
It can become nearly impossible. And if you might be thinking, but my good friend has read a lot about narcissism because that's what we're talking about right now. And she said that my husband's a narcissist or my wife's a narcissist, and she's read a lot about it, so she must know. Or, we hear this a lot, believe it or not, my counselor said that my husband is a narcissist. I actually asked a lady not long ago, and how many visits did your counselor have with your husband before she made that diagnosis? Oh, she's never met my husband.
Wow.
Then how did she make the diagnosis? Well, just based on what I said. I replied and said, if that is what she did, if she really diagnosed your husband as a narcissist, only by what you said, then number one, she is not professional. Number two, she is unethical. And number three, you need to run.
Run away. Yeah.
Because this person is leading you astray. And so if I think my spouse is a narcissist, and by the way, there are tons of things out there all over the internet. Answer these questions and decide if your spouse is a narcissist.
Well, yeah, they pop up on Facebook.
Yeah, they do. And all kinds of videos like, okay, since your spouse is a narcissist, this is what he or she's going to think or do, and this is what you need to do. And so people are actually living like that. Now, we could talk about a lot of other things too. You brought up sex addiction. How many people think their spouse is a sex addict? We actually had a guy come to our workshop one time because his daughter saw him sitting in a waiting room of a tire store, and he saw a Playboy in the trash can and reached over and picked it up and looked at it. Only one he's ever seen in his life. I mean, I've known this guy forever. And he was so shocked by what he saw, he threw it back in the trash can. A Playboy. His daughter saw that and said, "You're a sex addict," and sent him to us because, he was a sex addict. All right, so if you make these wrong diagnoses, what's it going to do to your marriage?
Yeah, well, it's definitely not going to help.
Not going to help. What harm might it do?
Well, it's definitely going to begin to erode the things we talk about. Once we start to diagnose a person in an area or put a person in a label, no matter what that label is, we find ourselves treating them that way.
Yeah.
So it's one thing if you have a correct understanding or diagnosis of what I am, okay, and you treat me that way, I'm probably going to be upset about it anyway, even though it's right. If you're off and you're wrong and you start to treat me that way, and here's the little asterisk you may put there, we might not even be aware we're treating the person that way. Because we plant the seed in our mind and that seed begins to germinate, maybe even not even in our consciousness. And of course, then once we have an idea, we go online, we begin to look at stuff, we read stuff, and there's some challenges about what you'll discover online. So you know about Marriage Helper when you're reading our material, what Joe's written and things like that. We have a certain perspective that we come from. We're for the marriage, we're for different things, and you can look at, I won't go into all that now. When you read an article or a bullet point or watch a video that's 4 or 5 minutes from someone you're unaware of their background, you have no idea of their framing of that person or the organization.
Exactly.
And so you might be getting a core that's in opposition to your value system, but watch, because the statement identifies with your perspective, you endorse it.
Right.
Which means you start listening to other stuff from that. So it's dangerous to just grab stuff haphazardly online because you don't really know the framing of that. The other thing that happens is once we have something in our mind, we typically gravitate to the things that validate what we already feel. So if I feel you're controlling, let's say, and I go online, I type in, what are the qualities of a controlling person?
Yeah.
And now I start reading them. Well, the difficulty in things like that are diagnosed, especially with mental or emotional disorders, is that they need to be clinically diagnosed. Because I joked earlier, as you read the things about narcissism, literally just about every one of those, there have been times I have fit into that category. You said, what about the part where there's no empathy? There have been times I've looked at people and my give a darn is broken. I don't care what they're going through.
Thanks for cleaning that up.
I cleaned that up. This is a PG version, those that know me. But in all seriousness, there have been times I've been that way, or I've been thinking about me, or I have big dreams. And anyway, you get the point. Well, very seldom do we go online and look at, well, what else could that be? The counter to it, because it validates us. And of course, the more you begin to fulfill that fantasy or go towards it, it actually makes you a little more needy or hungry for that information because we're trying to validate it. Now, I've had clients tell me, Joe, before they've said, well, the reason I'm going there and looking is I'm looking for hope. And I said, well, I don't know if I understand that. Tell me what that means. And they'll say something like, well, I'm looking that if I read the qualities of controlling or a narcissist or an addict, maybe it'll describe something that he's not.
And so therefore I'll think, oh, it's okay then.
Yeah, guess what? Nobody does research that way. It doesn't work. And of course, wrong input is going to be the wrong output.
And so what we've actually seen, now please hear this, and we're about to go into how can you tell if he or she's a narcissist. Understand, we've actually seen people, when they label their spouse, particularly with this one, because this one seems to be everywhere, that once they label their spouse, now, probably the spouse did have some egotistical characteristics, arrogant, sometimes they were not empathetic. I mean, the things we look at, and everybody situationally can go through those things, and sometimes a situation lasts a day, and sometimes it can last a year, but you understand it's still a situational thing. They're not like that all the time. But once this spouse, in his or her mind, diagnoses that spouse or accepts somebody else's, quote, diagnosis, end quote, of this spouse, then they start treating them differently. And we've seen the marriages fall apart. Yes, what he or she was doing, that arrogance, all those kinds of things certainly was contributory to the ending of the marriage.
Right.
But just as much so was the actions of this person who treated him or her in a certain way because they thought they were that way. In other words, just by believing that about your spouse, you might actually be a major contributor to destroying your marriage.
Oh, and definitely step a roadblock and a challenge in a reconciliation.
And so you're thinking, okay, you said it all along. Now wrap this thing up. How can I know if my spouse is a narcissist? First of all, understand that even medical doctors, unless they're a psychiatrist, are told you do not have the ability to diagnose a narcissist. Now, these are medical doctors that are taking their blood pressure and their temperature, and they're talking to them and understanding them. In other words, it's not something they found online. These are people actually interacting with them that are told you don't have the right training to make that diagnosis. And then you'll find people online, though, they'll do that. Hear this. When you see doctor in front of somebody's name, it does not necessarily mean that they have a PhD or that they're actually educated from a good school. I was actually on a national television show, nationwide television show, with a woman who called herself doctor. She said she had a doctor of psychology, which is not a PhD, by the way. And in our conversation, I asked her where she got it from, and she couldn't remember the name of the school.
Oh.
Uh-huh. Now, and so just because of the fact somebody has a doctor in front of his or her name and they have a tube, something on YouTube, does not necessarily mean they know what they're talking about. And no, I have an earned PhD from a very reputable institution, University of Sydney in Australia, consistently rated in the top 1% of universities in the world. And I do not have the ability to diagnose directly whether a person's a narcissist or not. Just because you have a degree doesn't mean you have that. You have to have specific and special training. Now, in the DSM-5, that's the one I have in front of me here that's open, there are 9 different characteristics of a narcissist. You have to have at least 5 of those, but it can't be situational. It can't be temporary. In other words, what they're going to look for is, okay, is the person arrogant? Well, a lot of people are. Is that bad for the marriage? Yeah. But arrogance can be dealt with.
Sure.
Narcissism,
It's pretty tough.
very, very tough. Do you realize that you start looking at the survey, somewhere between maybe 1/2 and 1% of the population is actually has narcissistic personality disorder? Do you know that people with narcissistic personality disorders are actually in the same cluster, cluster B? You don't need to understand all that means, but they're associated with things like borderline personality disorder, and these are people that can kill you that fast. Histrionic personality disorder, so forth and so on. And so, how would you know? You cannot do it by listening to somebody talking about the internet saying, if he or she is this, 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 and this, then he or she's a narcissist. You don't have the ability to do that, and that person certainly doesn't know the situation. Because the DSM-5 says things like this. It has to be, quote, clinically significant distress or impairment in important areas of functioning. Did you hear that? Clinically significant. Only those who are trained properly about clinical significance can make that. And that it's only when these traits are inflexible, when they are persisting, and they cause significant functional impairment or subjective distress. Now, I was reading that off that screen there. That's a direct quote. So it's not just referring to somebody who's egotistical, somebody who's arrogant, somebody who needs a lot of attention. That person is just a person. Now, do those things need to be remedied if you're going to make your marriage better?
Sure.
Absolutely. And we see that all the time, and we're able to help people with that. We've had people come to our workshop. Now, Jim leads the majority of our workshops, our 3-day intensives for marriages in crisis. Plus, he heads up all of our coaches. And how many coaches do we have now? 8 coaches, males and females. And so he has a very significant position in our nonprofit organization. And we can help people learn how to work out arrogance.
Yeah.
And understand what I'm doing is destructive to my spouse. I've got to stop living like this and start being like that. And we can help that. But if it's a true narcissistic personality disorder, nobody's going to help you unless maybe a psychiatrist, and it's probably going to require some pretty intense medications.
You know, one of the ways that we're able to help people is in their perception. People say that perception is reality, and that is accurate. So my wife and I are totally different. I'm a little more outgoing. If the steak's not good, I'm probably going to tell them, hey, my steak's not cooked right or whatever. Shannon likes her steak burnt, little, just under hockey puck, okay? Yeah. And if it came rare to her, she would probably still eat it. Her personality type does not contribute to confrontation. If it came to me, cooked too much, I'd say, hey, can you recook this? Can you take care of that? Well, if we're not careful, I can perceive Shannon as weak, and she can perceive me as arrogant. And it's based on how we see life, because we don't see things as they are, we see things as we are, all right? And so some of the challenge we have here that makes this so difficult to diagnose is your perception of what the other person's doing. And their actions and words, although they say, hey, you can tell, look at someone's actions and words, it tells you what they're thinking, it doesn't always tell you what's in a person's heart or what they're thinking. It can, but it doesn't always, and that perception can throw it off. And so that's why it's so important, as you hear Joe say, you can't diagnose this, you need to bring it to the right person, a person who can clinically look at it, and not just in a session. They don't do this in one session. No. I have to see this person, as it said, in multiple non-event driven situations. And in doing that, I can come up with some kind of understanding. And I say a clinician, not myself. Right. But nevertheless, the perception is so huge. How are you perceiving that person? And that's why you need someone that's qualified. And although all of our moms were doctors at some point,
yes,
they're not doctor enough to help you here.
Right. So if you're having trouble with your marriage because your spouse is arrogant, selfish, doesn't feel empathy, they're grandiose, they're always trying some new scheme, all those kinds of things that might lead you to believe that he or she is a narcissist, we can help you with that. You call us and we will help you with your marriage. Just call the number you're going to see on your screen there. And oh, by the way, we ask if you will subscribe down below and you'll get to see all of our videos. But if you think or convinced that he or she really is, then like Jim just said, take them to a professional who is thoroughly qualified, who can make several visits and do that. In the meantime, come see us. We will do everything we can to help you change what's happening in your marriage so you guys can have a good marriage. Here's the hope. In all likelihood, your spouse is not a narcissist, which means that he or she can change, and we will do our best to help you do that. Just give us a call. Thank you. Thank you, Jim.
Thanks.